Hello and welcome to this event titled All the Ghosts in the Machine. I'm Ruth Penfold-Mount, a sociologist at the Department of Sociology at the University of York. Today's event is part of the York Festival of Ideas Online. Although in a different format, the festival continues to aim to enhance York's reputation as a city of ideas and innovation through offering the highest calibre of public events. The 2020 festival has over 40 online events, offering an inspiring programme for all ages. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoy the adventure we're about to take you on. So let me introduce Elaine Kasket to you. She's a writer, speaker and psychologist who investigates the contemporary challenges to our privacy across the lifespan from cradle to grave. Elaine is a frequent contributor to print, broadcast and online media, speaking about life, death, privacy rights and the power of big tech. She's the author of All the Ghosts in the Machine, which is available at Fox Lane Books. And this book offers a clarion call to everyone who's never thought about death in the digital age. And it's this book that's going to lie at the heart of our conversation today. Welcome, Elaine. It's great to see you.
Thanks for having me. And thank you for making this event virtual and sort of grasping the nettle and doing that. I think it's really wonderful in 2020 when conferences are getting the courage and the tech together to do it. So congrats on that.
It's quite an achievement. So we're going to be spending some time talking about your book, Ghosts in the Machine. And for those who are watching who haven't read it yet, can you tell us what the book's actually about and why everybody should read it?
Well, you know, about 16 years ago or so, when studying death in the digital was really niche, I started out, very niche indeed at the time, I started out looking at it from like a psychologist's perspective, mainly focusing on the bereavement and how does mourning and bereavement change in the online context. And so as time went on, though, I started thinking about it from all sorts of different angles. For example, I found that it was impossible to really understand the emotional and psychological impact of living and dying online without understanding things about the law or like contract law or what the big tech companies were doing, or really understanding more about our relationship with those big tech companies and the kinds of rules and conventions that were governing our data. I felt I couldn't really understand the emotional and psychological impact without thinking about what makes us human and starting to think about artificial intelligence. And it started spiraling out in all of these different directions. So there was no one type of book chapter or journal article or whatever. It became so multifaceted. But even then, when I sat down, I thought, well, I'm mostly writing a book about death and dying in the digital age. But it turned out to be so much more than that. You know, it became really a book about privacy. It became about our relationship with Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. It became about digital ethics and about the choices that we make. And like I say, about what makes us human. So it ended up being the gift and curse of having it be this really faceted, interesting thing that's sort of unclassifiable. No bookshop knows where to put it in the bookshop. So I hope that Fox Lane Books has some kind of clear, like, where do we shelve this? So it really made kind of more of a kind of our digital lives and deaths kind of focus come to the fore.
So, you know, you're a psychologist. Did you ever think you would stumble into this arena? I mean, you know, I do a lot of work in sort of death scholarship. It's quite a shift.
Yeah, I mean, and I didn't stumble into it, and stumbling is totally the right word, but I didn't stumble in it as like a psychologist looking for, or an academic as I was at the time looking for something to research. I stumbled upon it as somebody who, like a lot of other people at the time in early 2007 or so, signing up to this new social media platform that everybody was talking about and searching for friends from school to see what they looked like now or to see if they were on the platform. That's how I came across it, because in the course of looking for somebody that I did know at school, I ran across a young woman, similarly named young woman to the friend I was looking for, who had an in memory of page on the site, which is what used to happen before Facebook memorialized profiles in any form. There would be groups that would be created to remember somebody. And since privacy considerations weren't so much of a thing at the time, people weren't thinking about it as much, kind of shielding their information online. It was very easy to click through to this young woman's in-life profile. But that's when my psychologist's interest was captured, not just by the mourning angle of it, but like how people were interacting with this ongoing these digital remains, and how it was different on the memory group versus the in-life group. But the continuity of the conversations and the interaction was really, really interesting to me. So I did, so I studied it formally in that psychological realm. But as I say, the more I thought about it and the more I experienced, and the more I talked about it, the more it got pulled. I never thought I would understand so much about the law, or I never thought I'd be sitting here talking to you about GDPR and and how this was relevant. I never thought I'd be thinking about tech to that extent. So yeah, although when I think about it, maybe it's not so coincidental, because for my master's, I looked at online counseling, which was a really new phenomenon then in 2001. And for my doctoral dissertation, I looked at physicians' emotional responses to patient death, which is a pretty relevant topic for now. So I kind of brought the tech and the death from my master's and my doctorate together in this new area for me. But yeah, never would have thought it. I think a lot of us have careers like that where we were like, how did I end up here again? Like, how did I become an expert in this? And of course, now it's much less niche than it was, because now we're talking about virtual funerals. We're talking about remote connection with the dying, during a time of COVID-19. When I was writing this book, the idea of live streaming or virtual funerals was super rare and niche, and it's not now. It's really front and central. So that's a really interesting moment.
So it's like at the moment, obviously, it's sort of really taking off this sort of the notion of digital remains, like you say, and like virtual funerals, all of these sorts of factors. But obviously, when you were sort of writing this book and starting to research, how did you recruit people? How did you find people to talk to? And, was it difficult to get people to talk to you?
Well, no, not once you found them, I suppose. But I think, the hardest thing for me was recruiting people, because I didn't want to just talk to those people that I knew personally, that had had experiences of some sort in the death and the digital realm. I knew all the academics I needed to talk to. They were already familiar to me, and I was familiar to them. That part was easy. It wasn't too difficult advertising on social media and Twitter and friends of friends to find a few key people who very generously volunteered to talk about their own experiences, sometimes quite painful experiences. A couple of occasions, I made contact with people associated with news stories, things that had happened that had been reported in the media. Holly Gazzard's father, Nick Gazzard, was one of those. Her killing had been reported in the media quite extensively, and I got in touch on the basis of that. So sometimes I followed news stories, and sometimes I reached out on social media and through sort of snowballing recruitment techniques, friends of friends, to get hold of people. The people that I found that I was a bit more shy to talk to were the developers who developed legacy websites and other things. I don't know what that was. I think I was just more familiar talking with people who'd had difficult experiences, or my fellow kind of colleagues or academics. But I kind of felt like the developers were more of a foreign species to me, and it took me a little bit longer to get up the guts to talk to them. And I think it was especially hard when I had critiques to offer, and I was talking to them and I was having a nice open conversation with them. I was asking them some tough questions, but then I was kind of realizing when it came down to writing the book, I was gonna, look at it from a variety of perspectives. And I found that a little complicated. That was new to me as a general nonfiction, sort of more journalistic author.
So when you were interviewing some of these people, I want to sort of try and unpick some of this a little bit more.
Yeah.
You were interviewing these people, you were talking about their experience of digital legacies. Was there anything that was kind of revealed that, took you really by surprise, or was even a bit shocking? Something you didn't anticipate?
Well, I would say that the thing that really, I was shocking. Not so much that. There was a lot that I kind of had some inkling of ahead of time, but the thing that really threw me for a loop the most, in a way I had sort of a delayed reaction to it, It was when I was talking to Jed Brubaker, who is an academic, but who also is a consultant with Facebook, and who's been really instrumental, together with one of his colleagues, in developing the current system of like legacy contact and memorialization and so forth. And there was one point during that interview when he talked about their role at Facebook. He said, you know, the role of the funeral director, you know, it's not far off, you know, from what we do. He said, we don't ask the bereaved to go and embalm the bodies of their, you know, loved ones themselves. You know, call this, what we're doing, an example of good design, so we can take care of things and meet people where we're at. And I think that the kind of concept that Facebook might actually see itself as a kind of curator or preserver, if like a funeral director for digital remains, and take that kind of really significant role and frame it like that. I think that sort of hit me later, the kind of like the power of that, and how much of a change it was in the 19th century in America, when the whole role of funeral directors was created in the first place, which is different than undertakers, that do so much more than undertakers that just might take care of the physical remains. They look after the bereaved's experience. You know, they sort of filter and shelter them from some of the more difficult things about the death. They kind of make things pretty, and here's this room where the person's laid out, and here, let us kind of shepherd you through the process. It was a very kind of let us look after you kind of role. And I thought, man, this is massive, that a tech company that never even set out to have this role in the first place would assume this. Let's take care of your emotional experience. Let's decide what's good for you and healthy for you and all right for you and not all right for you in grief, and we'll take that on. And I thought, that really brought up so many feelings for me. And so that was what hit me the most, I think, of any of the interviews that I did, talking to somebody in that position at Facebook.
Thank you. Now, there's another thing I want to pick up on. As I was reading your book, which I really enjoyed reading, by the way, I really couldn't put it down. I've been sat in the sunshine in my garden, taking notes, thinking through things. And I really love and relate to your idea of being a digital immigrant. Yeah. So digital immigrant being someone who's sort of born before 1980, and then you've got the sort of digital natives or sort of digital citizens who are born after 1980. Mm-hmm. And, you know, big reveal to everybody, I was born in 1979. So I'm really on the cusp of sort of being a both immigrant and citizen. And I'm not quite sure which one I really am. Now, in your book, you identify as this digital immigrant. But I'd really like you to talk a little bit more about how else you classify yourself, because you talk about digital pragmatists and curators and life loggers. Yeah. Could you tell people who are watching what those three categories are and which one you think you identify as?
Okay, first off, interesting, a couple of tweaks. The sociologist Mark Prensky, who is the person who developed that vocabulary of digital immigrants and digital natives, put the watershed year actually at 1985. So I would have been 15 in 1985 myself. So obviously, you know, somebody who was born, you know, like long before, you know, digital was any sort of thing. And in recent years, there's, because of a lot of critique of those concepts from a number of different angles, even Prensky himself has revised it to be digital visitors and digital residents. And I think that in doing that, part of what he was trying to do is kind of like break up this notion that when you were born is the main thing that, you know, kind of might determine your relationship with digital technologies. We certainly have a lot of silver surfers and a lot of people, you know, who were born way before 1985 that kind of have digital technologies as a really integrated, really familiar part of their, you know, modern being. So digital visitors and digital residents is kind of the vocabulary it's shifted to very, you know, more recently. You know, it's interesting that classification that I was coming up with, that sort of spectrum from going like from hermits, you know, digital hermits, all the way up to people who like log everything. There's so many different ways of like, you know, kind of chopping up or sort of classifying people. And that was kind of my way of doing it. I mean, I think that it's been a real journey for me, in that I feel like I really I never sort of logged every little thing about my life. And I think as a psychologist, I always had a real reticence about doing that anyway, because there's this historical notion that psychologists who practice psychotherapy need to be a bit almost like blank screen, and like you don't want your clients to find out too much about you. So you kind of, which is kind of a losing battle in these context collapse kinds of times. Your clients can usually find out quite a lot about you. But I was very definitely somebody who shared a lot of information online, not just about myself, but about other people, particularly my daughter, because I live far from my country of origin. So I am an immigrant to the UK, which was really instrumental in my using digital technologies as much as I did to stay connected. And during the course of writing and researching the book, I became much more of a digital pragmatist, where I started using the online sphere for only those things I really needed to use it for. And I stopped, as needed, and as needed professionally. I stepped really way back from kind of moving further up that spectrum, based partly on the research that I was doing and based partly on the conversations with my daughter that the research inspired me to have. So I think that now, although I use digital technologies for everything, professionally, more or less, and these days of lockdown, obviously there's a lot of socializing that happens as well. But in terms of the information I capture and store and disseminate to others, particularly where it involves other people's data, I'm extremely conservative about that now. Extremely conservative. I feel like my feeling is that I took certain liberties or made certain assumptions that I wish I hadn't taken with respect to my daughter's digital footprint, eventual digital legacy, digital presence. So that kind of gets into my concerns about privacy that I'm writing about in my next project, and privacy across the lifespan.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, isn't it, how actually our sort of use of digital sort of technologies and, particularly with social media and things, actually how it's, if we start to reflect on how we use it, our ways of using it change as we start to think about it in more detail. Mm-hmm. And that certainly seems to be what I'm picking up from what you're sort of saying. And it's like you say, relating it, particularly as if you're a parent, or you're sharing images of family members, you've got to think about the digital footprint you're creating for them as well.
Yeah, and that's an example of something I never thought would happen. When you set out to write a book, a nonfiction, you submit a nonfiction book proposal where they make you outline the chapters before you've written it. And you get the contract on that basis. And I hated that, because I've always used to, kind of unfolding, as I go along. And one of the chapters that I did not anticipate writing was a chapter at the end that had more to do with sharenting, kind of an online sort of sharing. And I never really realized that this would have relevance to this book. I never really realized that would be a logical place to end up for the ending chapter. But so it is, so it happened. And that's just one example of the ways that, kind of thinking about your digital legacy inevitably sort of puts you into thinking about your digital life and the choices that you're making. And, whether you're talking about genealogical privacy, sending off your spittle to, Ancestry or 23andMe or whatever it is, and, finding out more about your family history that way. Nobody ever does that without making potentially really powerful privacy decisions about other people as well as themselves. Because both, DNA and the internet connects us to all of these other people and their data, and, every time you put something on social media and tag somebody else, you're taking a decision. You're taking a decision to put some information out there about them. When I'm live and doing presentations with audiences at festivals, I often do this eulogy for a digital stranger exercise where some very kind volunteer gives a way in to their digital footprint, like here's my Instagram account or here's my Facebook profile. And then people break up into groups, and in only about a quarter of an hour, they build a eulogy, sort of trying to really sum up the essence of who you were, and then they present it. And oftentimes the volunteer is really shocked about how much is out there about them that is really telling. And they say, oh, I don't remember putting that up. And it's because they didn't. It's because somebody else did. you know, whether it's their workplace or their family member or whomever, like they just don't realize how much information other people are logging about. So the idea that you create and maintain your own digital footprint is only the tip of the iceberg. So
Yeah.
that's kind of where I got to with this book. I thought, you know, I'm okay with like crafting and controlling and trying to kind of be responsible for my own, you know, kind of image online and my own legacy, but I want to step way back from making decisions about other people's.
Yeah. So how does that start to relate with notions of grieving online, which is something, again, you really address in the book? And, you know, this sort of digital realm offers a real space for the development of grieving. And we have these digital remains. We live our lives in the digital realm. So what about this grieving online? Does it work? Is it okay?
What an interesting question. Does it work? Does it work to do what, Ruth? Tell me, what do you mean by does it work?
So does it sort of create sort of communities or these sort of safe spaces? In your work, you talk a little bit about these kind of almost like cemeteries that you can sort of walk through, but you're not physically walking through them.
Yeah.
You know, but you know, is that uncomfortable territory for people, or do you think this is something that we're heading towards? This is the future of sort of dealing with digital remains.
Well, the reason I asked you the question about what you meant by work is that it kind of reminded me of Sigmund Freud's terminology of grief work, and you know, this idea that we've kind of acquired in, you know, kind of post industrial revolutions or 20th century Western kind of civilization, that like you kind of go through grief work and you sort of resolve it, or so it kind of gets fixed or healed or whatever at the end, which is a concept that you know, that I question and, you know, kind of, you know, critique really heavily in the book. But in terms of working, in terms of connecting one to a community of mourners, in terms of kind of helping give people what they need in terms of feeling connected in a continuing bonds kind of way with not just the person who's died, and with the kind of remnants and the artifacts of that relationship you had with them, but also to a community of other people that knew them. And it's really effective for that because the community is always already created, and the dead person's digital remains, as it were, often stay embedded for an indeterminate period of time in that same social network. So the dead sort of remain in their social networks, or interwoven, you know, in the email accounts, or interwoven in various other exchanges like WhatsApp messages or whatever else, for an extended, unpredictable, indeterminate period of time. And that phenomenon of the digital remains, the dead, their presence, their image, their voices, their movements, whatever, sticking around in a socially influential kind of way, is a pretty interesting novel phenomenon that, you know, really makes us think about, well, what is the role of the dead in society now that they can remain ongoing, socially influential, if not socially participatory? And so kind of connecting with the digital remains of the dead, talking to them, you know, continuing to post, you know, photos and memories of them, continuing to go back through or reconnect with archives of conversations, etc., is very much the kind of new normal, because it's so available and it's so integrated. And sometimes even when we're not thinking about it, depending on whether something's memorialized or whatever, it might pop up. You know, it might pop up unexpectedly in a way that we don't plan or invite. And people worry about that. They think, oh, isn't that terrible? But the thing is, when you think about the offline realm, you can be walking down the street and see a Pret and remember the last time you saw your friend at Pret, and that can come upon you unawares as well. So it does happen, you know.
I really like that idea of the sort of, you know, socially present, of the social presence of the dead, because we are so plugged into this digital realm. And that kind of leads on to the next thing I'd really like to get you to sort of talk a bit about, and that's the notion of access and control.
Oh, yeah.
And it really comes across as a strong theme throughout your work. And, you know, this access and control of digital remains is really central to the conflict that surrounds or goes on in the digital realm. So could you talk a little bit about, you know, what are the difficulties faced by the living trying to control and access these digital legacies?
Absolutely. So the question kind of becomes, to whom do the digital dead belong? and who is responsible for caring for them, and somehow, or making decisions about how they manifest, whether you can visit with them, which bits, like, this is in a hugely contested area. It's almost like, you imagine, like, sometimes in some countries, I think they have rules about someone's ashes after cremation not being able to be kind of like divided up, and some jurisdictions don't have a problem with that. It's almost as though, imagine that there's like a fight over the ashes and who gets to have the ashes, and kind of like what kind of container they should be in, and whether you should scatter them or whether you should, like, kind of keep them. It's like a fight over the ashes, except it's digital dust. And the new player in this that we didn't really see coming is big technology companies, because they're the people that, while the person is alive, is housing and managing and sort of like looking after the data in, along the terms of the contract you've made with them, all that small print that you sort of say, yeah, fine, tick, 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 that stuff. And because after a person dies, they're generally out of contract, those companies are able to continue mostly doing with that data whatever they want. Because there's not a whole lot of legislation or regulation governing what should be done with this digital dust, with these digital ashes. GDPR says, member states, do what you want. We're out of it. They're like, this regulation does not cover the day of the deceased. Good luck with that. It's just like, have fun with all that chaos. So there's all these misunderstandings, because we're still in this kind of like teenage, kind of adolescent period of like getting used to our digital kind of world, where we're still finding ourselves falling into the assumption that digital stuff is going to obey the same rules as physical stuff. Like, well, if you haven't made a will and you die intestate, without a will, then, who's the next of kin, and like, who does the property and asset revert to? Is it the state? Is it part of the family? And that's very local in terms of the laws that govern that. But people think, oh, well, surely my next of kin will be able to have access to this because they're my next of kin or my spouse. So they make assumptions that they can transfer accounts, or that they can call up Facebook or iTunes and say, hi, I'm the next of kin, that person's dead, here's the proof, I need access to that. And then they're surprised when the company says, well, doesn't matter who you are, like, one contract, one account, one user, you're not that person, we can't give you that. And people are like, what? So they're surprised because they haven't realized the extent to which digital stuff and accounts will act differently and won't follow those rules that they're used to. So to find out that Facebook is actually more powerful than family in determining what happens to a person's digital remains is a big wake-up call for a lot of people. And, and then, companies will sort of say, they'll sort of say, you're asking for something inappropriate, basically. And the family's like, this was my person, So, and then, because grief is incredibly individual, and is different for everyone. There's no right or wrong. Like, if you want to access letters and you don't want to access letters, there's nobody that can tell you that one of you is right and one of you is wrong. It's what you need, in your grief. But if you have these like centralized digital remains, and the parents hate them and want them gone, but the friends, that's the most critical, important thing, then that's an issue. Different mourners will want different things. But users or people who can access that data don't usually have fine-grained control over like what kind of relationship they want with it. Twitter at the moment doesn't allow, just viewers to download an archive of a deceased person's tweets. Only the account holder can do that. Everybody else has to screenshot and cut and paste. So there's all sorts of the landscape of the digital, kind of age is littered with issues of access and control, when it comes to deceased people's data. And corporations might have some incentives or financial incentives for holding on to that data that they don't really like to talk about.
Yeah. So it's this huge, the three big words, isn't it? It's access, it's control, and privacy.
Yeah, and ownership.
And ownership, indeed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, there seems to be an awful lot of people, particularly since sort of the Cambridge Analytica thing with Facebook and stuff, people are like, oh, privacy. And then we keep signing up for things. We keep still giving away our privacy.
Yeah, for a song.
So why do you think we're concerned about it, but we're not actually acting on it. We're not improving our privacy behavior. Any ideas?
Yeah, no, absolutely. For one thing, we're being really, really powerfully behaviorally shaped. This is, you're aware that, Shoshana Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, was with good reason one of the biggest books of 2019. I think Barack Obama sort of said this is one of my big books. That, if you have 30 hours to read, it's a big book, but it's really good. But I mean, the behavioral, the skill with which our behavior is being kind of manipulated and nudged and reinforced and pushed or whatever, operating beneath the level of our conscious awareness is a really a big thing. Our attention is being directed this way and that. Our behavior is being reinforced in all sorts of subtle ways. So it's in the interests of all sorts of platforms, companies, apps to nudge us away from caring about our privacy and in tempting us with all of the kind of convenience and gratification that we could get. There was an interesting study a few years ago that I talk about in the book. It was a Spanish study where they asked people to put a monetary value on their privacy, which they measured by sort of saying, how much can I pay you to deliver over your entire search history, which is one of those digital bits of your digital footprint that can be super revealing that we don't think about as being part of our digital footprint. More revealing than the stuff we mean to put out there is the stuff we might search at 3 o'clock in the morning, And people put that value at about the same amount as it would cost you to buy a Big Mac in a Madrid McDonald's, like a few euros, And that's extraordinary when you think about the sensitivity and the personal nature of the data in your search history. And so it's so there's quite a few things going on there. One is that we are really incentivized to get the things. Like right now, we're in lockdown, and online platforms are our only way for many of us of kind of connecting to those things that we need, social interaction and sort of work that we need to do. And somebody might be saying, oh, well, your privacy is compromised if you do that. And you're sort of like, well, usually I worry about that, but now I don't care because this is important and this is what I need, So we kind of weigh up these things. And also, I think we find it hard to conceive of the potential implications of our giving over our data to these companies. Partly because it's labyrinthine and it's concealed and there's hiddenness and there's all that kind of stuff about it by design. But partly because some of the implications might not even have been realized yet. So for example, the eventual implications of all of this biometric privacy stuff with us surrendering our DNA to all these databases and all that kind of stuff might only really come into play later on. Like it might not be harming us now to the extent that it could be exploited in the future in ways that we haven't worked out yet or that haven't happened yet. So there's a lot of different reasons we might underestimate the potential value of keeping ourselves to ourselves.
Yeah. So what I'd like to make a link to now is the big question. Do the dead have a right to privacy?
I'm so fascinated by this question. And I'll tell you why, and it relates to AI. So historically, the dead have not had a right to, now privacy is a right that's sort of enshrined in the United Nations, kind of like, the human right. Privacy is supposed to be, and it's a very important psychological thing. Privacy is very linked to self-determination and control over decisions about who you want to allow access to your private person and being able to calibrate that. So privacy is intimately linked to that. And obviously the dead don't have those concerns. The dead have so little right to privacy off their own backs, as it were, that in a lot of places, this must come as a surprise to people, even desecration of a corpse is not necessarily a crime. It's not a crime against the corpse. It's about the kind of pain and suffering to the family, and so it's not even about, the person of the dead person. So they don't traditionally have that or any other human right. Now, never before have we been in a situation where people left behind such a wealth of comprehensive, personally identifiable, personally sensitive data. But again, that's not a problem for the dead person themselves, but in the online environment, all of that data is intimately connected to all this other data of still living persons. So if a grieving family is granted by some not really getting the plot court access to Facebook messages that they kind of, or email accounts, the contents, right? they're giving over the privacy of all these still living users that should have their own expectations of knowing and controlling how their data is handled, because the data of the dead is connected to that. So until we have some sort of blockchain technology that allows us to sort of reel back, like reeling line back into a fishing reel, all of the data associated with a particular person, and sort of, sort of untangling it from all this other data, it's a really, I kind of feel like it's the whether the dead still have a right to privacy is intimately connected to the question of privacy of other people because of the way the online environment is. However, so we're already having debates about whether artificially intelligent entities that are new programmed should have some level of rights. So what if they can solve complex problems? What if they develop something like feelings? What if they, like we're having those conversations? That's about AI that's programmed new. And what happens in a not very distant day when artificial intelligence and when it has its roots in a once living, like carbon-based breathing human life form, and that ability to solve complex problems, or that ability to feel something, is a continuation of those aspects of it, what it once meant for that person to be human. So that the persistent digital remains of someone is a kind of a subset of humanity that is ongoing and active and interactive. So that, to me, is an incredibly complex question that actually needs to be being thought about now, because we are not that far off from that. And think about deep fake technologies, how fast those are advancing. James Dean, the late James Dean, is in a new film coming out, because of what was able to be done from that video footage that he left behind. Thinking about, what if somebody had access to every single Zoom call that you have made since lockdown, including this one? How effective of a deep fake that could be deployed either during your life, perhaps to impersonate you for criminal purposes, or deployed after your death? What kind of consequences could that have? Somebody could easily deep fake you or me on the basis of all of the video calls we've had over the last 2 months. No bother. And think about that. Think about the sort of ways to which that could be turned, whether it's moral, ethical, legal, financial. What is the future of identity theft and impersonation look like? Used to be you only need to steal somebody's national insurance number or their social security number in the United States to be able to perhaps kind of get benefits or kind of open accounts in a person's using a person's identity. Look at everything that's available now for the people who have access to it.
Whole new range of crimes that can potentially develop from this particular realm.
Especially while it's so hard for family to sort of even know where all the accounts are, to wrap up a digital estate. If criminals are able to kind of exploit the period of time between somebody's death as reported in the paper, whatever, and the families being able to get kind of a handle on everything, that's a pretty sensitive period of time when accounts remain unclosed.
Absolutely, and that gets even more complicated if they're a public figure who has died.
Indeed.
Now, you mentioned James Dean. I know he's being sort of resurrected to perform, but we've seen other performances, whether it's Peter Cushing. We've seen musicians, and you talk about several of them in your book. Roy Orbison and Maria Callas and Michael Jackson have been performing after death live, which still raises those slightly, is this creepy or is this the future kind of questions. But we've got those sorts of individuals whose digital legacies are so huge. Will they ever be able to die? Will we let them? And trying to disentangle them, it would be incredibly complex. Sort of the higher profile you are, potentially the bigger your footprint, and you can rival the living for jobs.
Yeah, well, this is really interesting, and I talk a little bit about it in the book. That one of the debates about Maria Callas and her hologram, performances, and resurrecting her career in that way. Maria Callas had a very particular, sound, and it was very influential, and she sort of dominated, the opera scene at the time that she was alive. and now, and so just allowing opera to evolve, or for new styles and, kind of fresher kinds of voices to come to the fore, and to feel that they still have to be in active competition or sort of be compared to Maria Callas, whose like influence goes. I mean, you can argue, you don't need digital sort of stuff to do that, like Mozart, still continues to be really influential, but there's been a lot of scope for classical or classical style music to evolve beyond that. But if it were possible for like, Mozart to be, resurrected, if we had footage from that, such, I don't know what difference that would then make, or how that would narrow the field, or kind of prevent wider kind of creative evolution. But you're right, if a human being was an absolute expert in the job, and one of the ways that people are sort of saying, oh, here we should use people's footprints to be able to train up or hand over jobs, to people, because oftentimes handovers aren't so great. Something happens, and could you use an AI developed from somebody's stuff to, for continuity? But you're like, well, why would it be used for continuity? If the AI were so good at it, would the AI just not keep on doing it with all of their, accumulated expertise, and not leave room for those who come after, as you say?
So considering that all of us, whether we are high profile public figures, whether we're just average individuals, we're going to leave these digital remains. What do you recommend we do to prepare for our digital legacies?
Right. Well, one of the things that I would definitely, just from a pragmatic standpoint, and of course, these days, a lot of unexpected things are happening as people might get sick, with coronavirus, or, people who are younger are suddenly sort of thinking, oh, maybe I should make a will. Maybe I should kind of be thinking about things, which is to the good. And in the course of thinking about those things, don't forget your digital kind of portion of your life, and ask yourself the question, if people didn't have my passwords, or if people weren't able to access my devices or accounts, are there ways in which they would struggle to get hold of practical information that they actually would need to settle an estate, or to have information about bank account, or whatever, the same kinds of things an executor would need to kind of, and would they be blocked from important sentimental or personal things that I would want them to have? There was a really heartbreaking case that went to court here in the UK about iCloud stored photos of somebody who'd passed away, and all of these family photos were on there, and his young daughter wasn't able to see them, and they took Apple to court, et cetera, et cetera. So basically think about what, so because you need to assume that people will not be able to get into your devices or accounts. All those layers of password protection that we have, are there for a reason, and it's going to make it very difficult for anybody to access your estate. And if they call up a company, the company will say no. But this is for good reason as well, because really we shouldn't be reliant on giving people passwords to get into our accounts, and opening up other people's privacy for scrutiny, or enabling identity impersonation, or getting into the wrong hands. So that's just not the way forward. If there's important information you want or need people to have, make sure that it's transformed into some sort of locally controlled format that is more easily accessible, that's not mediated by some sort of third party with terms and conditions. So that's a very important pragmatic sort of thing to say. The other thing, one of the things that I did as I was researching the book, I mentioned kind of coming off I started returning to a lot of sort of storytelling stuff, and really making sure that I was passing on information to my daughter about her family, or like, whatever it is, through the good old, traditions of oral sort of storytelling, that have worked for, millennia, worked for Beowulf, can work for us. It's because I thought, I don't want to kind of neglect, those things. I don't want to sort of have all of the information that, is worth passing on to future generations, kind of contained within this digital thing that can and will degrade, disappear, have access to it blocked. I want to make sure that I'm transferring it in that way. So those are two major things. I'm really conscious of how much time too I'm spending. The time that I spend with my daughter, kind of face to face, and doing things with her is going to be more important than anything that I commit to binary code for the, for her to look at in future. And I really try to keep that front and center. I feel like writing this book really returned me to some of my essential values and whether I was aligned with them or not. And so I think that sometimes scrutinizing our digital life and choices can get you there too, to that point of contemplation.
That's some great tips. Thank you. And finally, in your book, and I quote, you ask, would you like your legacy to live on in the world forevermore, or would you like your digital traces to disappear altogether? What do you want?
I don't consider myself important enough to have my data contributing to heating up the data centers of the world. Because right now, one of the big costs to the environment of these data centers is the data of the deceased, all sorts of data, irrelevant data, all that kind of stuff. And I don't, to whatever extent something that I have to contribute to the world in an ongoing way that's going to be useful to future generations, knowledge that I have, perspectives that I have that might be useful, sure, I don't have any problem with that being sort of transferred, kind of to future generations to the extent that it's useful. But the vast majority of the digital footprint that I've produced don't want that heating up the world's data centers. But I take responsibility for that myself. If I am going to clean out my digital house and sort of stop being a digital hoarder, I need to kind of make sure that I'm practicing digital minimalism in my life so that I'm not storing up those things that don't need to be stored.
Thank you. So it's been fabulous to talk with you, Elaine. I've certainly learned a lot, and it's, I found your book really challenging and just a really good read, which, I think is always good. And I want to say thank you to everybody who's been watching this event. I hope it's provided some good food for thought, and I hope you start planning for your own digital legacies. The recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival website. And also remember that Elaine's book is available from Fox Lane Books. We very much hope that you'll continue to be engaged with the York Festival of Ideas. Check out the website, which is yorkfestivalofideas, all one word, .com/, for full details of all the events in the festival programme. We'd love to hear your thoughts on these events and continue the conversations using the hashtag #YorkIdeas.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for having me. And if you want to keep up with what I'm doing and thinking about, you can follow me on Twitter at Elaine Kasket or on Medium at Elaine Kasket. And my website is elainekasket.com.
Thank you.